when ready. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Parktown Girls for the finals of the 2026 Pan-African Debating Championship. Before I introduce the motion and the speakers, I would like to remind you of the following. The audience is to keep quiet during the speakers' addresses. No notes may be passed from the audience to the speakers. No cell phones to be operated during the debate. If the audience's behavior is deemed unacceptable, they will be asked to leave. The motion before the floor today is African states should offer automatic citizenship to people of African descent living abroad. Proposing the motion is Spring Boys A1. Opposing the motion is Northwood A1. The speakers for proposition is Impendulo Matebula, Sandile Muta, and Joseph Mubenda Mambo. The speakers for opposition are Siobhan Pillay, Adam Sidat, and Arav Suraj. And I would like to call first proposition speaker to start the debate.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, identity is incredibly significant to any person, foreign or not. The roots from which you come from and your descent are incredibly significant in this debate. As a result, family and cultural heritage is also significant, particularly for African states, at the point at which we are even willing to revere it. Salutations to House at Large. My name is Mbindu Matibula, and I'll be representing side proposition as their first speaker. So panel, several things that you can expect from me in today's debate and my speech. First, going to do some setup, then I'm going to get into some characterizations, and then I'll get into our substantive matter. Cool. So, setup then. 2 points on this. First thing, what does this automatic citizenship look like? And then second thing, what do these people with African descent, what does the concept of African descent look like? Then I'll get into how the people with this African descent living abroad look like in my characterizations. Cool. So, what does this automatic citizenship look like? It looks like A, not having to go through strenuous processes within status quo as we see when it comes down to citizenship processes. It looks like B, right? At the point at which you now don't have to necessarily go to places like VFS and you need to certify your papers as a foreigner, right? So in general, I'll take POI as at a later stage. So in general, what this does is just, it probably makes the entire process a lot easier at the point at which you don't have to go through the entire strenuous process. Second part of setup, what does African descent look like? It's essentially it's essentially like an individual having anyone in their family from previous generations who was born in Africa and actually had African citizenship initially. Cool, then what's our stance panel? We think in this debate, identity is an incredibly significant part of humanity at the point at which you can only find it on our side panel. So, thus as a result, on their burden panels, opposition needs to prove why you can actually still find us on their side in the most effective way that you can find it on our side. Cool. Now that we're done with setup, let's get into the model. So what's our model panel? First thing then, again, as we say in this motion, we're essentially going to be allowing automatic citizenship to these people with African descent, aka probably African generations in the past who have actually had African citizenship, to actually have automatic citizenship at the point at which they choose to then start to come into Africa or live in Africa. Cool. So how are we going to do this? First thing to note, with regards to actually figuring out whether they have African descent or not, we're going to be using DNA profiling. At the point at which we find this is very, very probable and like pretty realistic, at the point at which the people who like lived in Africa in the past, or maybe like in like older generations of their family, would probably like have their DNA still in Africa, and then it would still probably be relevant in Africa. So then at that point, that would be pretty effective. But the second thing that we're going to do, it's very, very crucial for this individual to actually like apply for this type of citizenship. So it's not inherently just like going to be granted to like anyone. It's going to be specifically granted to people who actually are incentivized to want this particular thing. Who's going to be doing this? Most probably the African governments who are actually in these states, and then like the health organizations in those particular places to handle things like DNA profiling. Cool. Now that we're done with the model, let's get into like some characterization. So 2 parts of characterization then. Firstly, a layer on how do these people with like African descent who are living abroad look like, and then second characterization more on like the African nation incentivization to actually like allow this whole automatic citizenship thing. So first part then, how do these people essentially look? They look like A, people who probably feel like outcasts due to like this entire stigma surrounded around foreigners, okay? They look like B, people who are probably born here but then who are probably like not born in African nations, right? But then still have that African descent, as we've said. But then it looks like C, they're probably people who tend to value the roots and traditions and actually want to apply for this automatic citizenship as a result of their African descent. So why is this particular characterization true? For 3 reasons. First thing, panel, we have to understand that at the point at which they feel like outcasts, they probably feel like outcasts because of the stigma, as I've said, right? But the stigma directly kind of like, it's kind of like perpetuated by society at the point at which the only thing that really constitutes them as a foreigner is that they're like living abroad and that they weren't born in Africa. So we find this as like a kind of like superficial foreignness. I'll take them at a late stage, right? So we kind of find this as like superficial foreignness at the point at which we can then actually deal with that when we give them this automatic citizenship. But then the second reason, panel, why these people probably look the way that we characterize them is because this motion only affects them specifically, which is why we should then set the parameters to these kinds of people specifically. Cool. Now that we're done with that, what are the implications of this now that we've done that characterization? It means that they're the most vulnerable actors most probably, and that our impacts are far more impactful at the point at which they actually apply to these people. But then before I get to my second characterization, I'll take a view on it.
If the stigma exists because of how disconnected they are from the African continent, how is a document going to change that?
Well, plain and simply, it's not just going to be a document essentially. At the point at which that document is there to prove that they're not only just getting automatic citizenship, but they're getting automatic citizenship at the point at which they have African descent. And it's important to note that at the point at which you have that African descent, you're probably going to get a lot less stigma at the point at which people are definitely going to feel like you actually like are more like them, especially in these African nations, since you essentially like, even if like your bloodline goes far back, you do essentially like come from Africa at some point or like some extent. Cool, back to this characterization of why African nations would probably be incentivized to actually like do this whole automatic citizenship. 2 parts here. First thing, panel, at the point at which you actually subscribe to this motion, it just allows easier access to this whole identity idea and this cultural heritage and family of your past. Because as a person, when you're incentivized to probably like go with this motion and actually like come into these African nations and want this automatic citizenship, your probable main incentive is for this whole understanding of where do you come from and what are your roots. But then B, it just reduces the stigma and like it just reduces the stigma that people have around descent foreigners, as you said. Cool. Now that we've done that characterization panel, let's get into our substantive matter. But before I do that, I'm just going to do our case split. So, as first speaker, I'm going to be looking at the point on like how we like get better benefits for these individuals. And then my second speaker is going to look at 2 points there on the practicality of the current mechanism of actual citizenship, and then the second thing on stigma degradation. Cool. Right, now into the argument panel. We just get better benefits for these individuals. Right, so some framing here. First thing to note is that these people probably aren't given an opportunity to explore their culture at the point at which they're just afraid of this stigmatization that is probably going to occur at the point at which they choose to come into an African nation. But B panel, again, they just feel like outcasts in society simply for not just having a simple document. Cool. So then there's 3 reasons why we probably get better benefits for them. First reason, they just get a chance to explore their family's culture and roots panel. At the point at which you make it easier for them to actually access At the point at which you make it easier for them to access like living in African nations, you then actually give them a much better opportunity to then access this culture groups that they're so incentivized to understand. But second reason, panel, with free roam and this kind of motion, you get a better understanding of your background. And panel, this is important to note, because as I said at the beginning of the debate, identity to any human is incredibly significant, panel. And an important part to your identity is probably where you come from. But then, panel, why is this important, panel? It's because, as we've proven to you, they are most probably the most vulnerable actor, and we should definitely be looking to actually benefit them and cater for them the most, which is most probably what opposition is not going to do for you, and their model is probably not going to do that for you the way that we do it. Even at the point at which they say it's not mutually exclusive, we still will.
I now call first opposition speaker to start the case for opposition.
Okay, hi everyone, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'd like to call myself in 3, 2, 1. Members of the chair, notice in today's society we are trying to stem away from things that are like being given to people based on their culture and race. We as a society are trying to advance to an ideology in which the merit you are granted things is based on what you contribute to society. And that is the very clash we have within today's debate. Two clashes for you today. One, their model causes illegitimate citizenship, and secondly then, they degrade Africa's economic and political state, right? In terms of case split, I'm going to be proving to you that this is illegitimate citizenship granted to these people, and secondly then, my second is going to be proving to you how there is a deficit to the economy and to its political state, right? Cool, what is our model? We are not going to grant automatic citizenship to these individuals, right? Before I get into any setup, let me get into a few responses, right? Firstly then, in terms of their mechanism, right? We tell you that there are two issues with this. Firstly then, their mechanism is completely contradictory when they tell us that they want automatic citizenship to be effective and efficient, right? So they tell us, cool, what we're going to do is, we're going to test almost every African person and then see if there's validity within being able to enter the country. We tell you I'll take you later. I tell you that it's completely unfeasible, one, for you to take the DNA linkage of African people, multiple African people, and trying to see if millions of different people are valid for your citizenship. So one, it's ineffective. And secondly, it's contradictory, because by having to apply, you're going against the very mechanism of efficiency. Because we see when you apply for government things, such as Home Affairs and SA, it could take up to months to just get an ID book. So we still think on their side of the world, it's completely inefficient for you to be able to come to these countries and gain citizenship in the first place, right? So in impact, their mechanism doesn't work on their side of the world. We are winning in terms of mechanization without giving you anything already, right? Secondly then, they tell us in terms of stigmatization, is going to be broken down just because they have an ID book saying they are of African descent. I tell you, if you do every single thing different, which is what these people are obviously stigmatizing you for, having a different accent, eating different food, having different ideologies and cultural traditions, those people are stigmatizing you for those things. Me having a documented book telling me that I'm also like an African person isn't going to make you like me. One, because you don't know that I have that ID book in the first place. And secondly, everything that made you like scared of me or not like me in the first place is still going to be existing. Your whole point of stigmatization doesn't count, right? And then in terms of culture, it isn't mutually exclusive to your side, right? People can still experience culture without using the government's resources that they don't contribute. So within my setup, I'm going to prove to you that citizenship requires you to contribute to the economy. And on their side of the world, they still say cool, you can just come here for free. We think that's not mutually exclusive, because people who actually care about tradition can use their money from these abroad places, come here and experience the culture without the expense of government resources, right? And we think even if they can still immigrate to the country using a long strenuous process. They have nothing different from status quo and there's nothing they can claim. Cool. Impactfully, I one side proposition to give us a reason as to how these benefits of culture is mutually exclusive to their side of the world. Lovely. In terms of setup, what do these African states look like? These African states are quite poor, right? With some of the richest countries, such as South Africa, not even being able to afford like its own people and service delivery. Look at our country, for example. We've had to go through so many things such as load shedding, having water cuttages, etc. There's already a failure to service delivery of its own people. We think then that it lacks the capacity to be able to hold more citizens and citizens from other countries abusing our resources. Secondly then, in terms of automatic citizenship, this looks like just existing, having an African descendant and being able to come into the country. What does citizenship holistically look like? We tell you citizenship looks like being a member of the government social contract and participating in that, right? This looks like being able to enter and leave the country freely, making use of government resources, and like how exactly is this earned by external people like as per status quo? We see in countries such as England, this looks like having a working visa for 5 years and being in their country and contributing to that economy, because when you contribute to the economy, you are providing taxes, GDP, etc. That makes you deserving of having the country's resources, like your right to transport, free transport, and RDP housing, right? So cool. What does the people living off like Africa like look abroad, like these descendants? So it looks like having very different ideologies, because you're obviously growing up in a different continent and having a different way of living. This looks like people who don't contribute to these African nations, because you're obviously living in a different country, right? So these people exist on a spectrum two ways, right? So there's one, people who just don't care about these traditional countries and are likely to exploit these countries, or two, people who actually care and visit these countries for the culture. And as per status quo, you can see people just booking trips to Africa to see their religion. This looks like people traveling back to Egypt to see the pyramids of Giza, etc. Right? So what are the issues necessitating this context, right? We see firstly then, people aren't deserving of citizenship in general for not just doing anything, but just existing. They need to work for this, right? And secondly, Africa doesn't have the capacity to hold all of these people and lack the capacity to hold the very people of their nation as per status quo. Cool. So, in terms of argumentation, what do I give you? I'm going to be proving to you that there is an illegitimate, given citizenship to these people. My analysis is threefold. So firstly then, it's going to create inaccurate voting citizenship, right? So we think if you live in a different country for your whole life and you just move into a country, when you have citizenship, you have the right to voting. And we think through having the lack of info about this country because you're living in another one, this looks like you've been coerced extremely easily or manipulated by other political parties to buy into their ethos, right? So this looks like me just coming to KZN and the MK giving me a free shirt. And I think, yo, these guys are pretty cool guys. I'm going to vote for the MK. This is going to create an invalid voting choice because one, it was coerced because I was just given a shirt. And secondly, then it was uninformed because I don't know the true historical context of this country. Like how its former leader, Jacob Zuma, was stealing millions and millions of rand from our country, right? So we think the impact then is that the exercise of use of citizenship is ineffective. Secondly then, it also creates an improper representation of the electoral system and will also create unhappy locals because you're not going to get an accurate government that they actually voted for. Secondly then, we tell you that there's an abuse of government resources. So, as we all know, Africa is not the richest place, so we can assume that other continents obviously have a better quality of life. This then results in those people likely to be staying in the overseas and only using this African nation to exploit it or towards their own benefit, right? So what exactly would that look like? That would look like me just coming to having my OCI, meaning overseas citizenship of India, going to India, using their resources and contributing absolutely nothing to the economy, and then going back to my first world country where I have everything, right? We think then that government resources are ineffectively used on people who aren't actually contributing to the economy, right? And why exactly do we care? We care about the unjust use of resources because Africa doesn't have ample resources to be giving left, right, and center. When we see that there's a failure to service delivery, so it's already putting strain on an already affected system, right? Cool. Thirdly, in terms of unequitability, right? This is in two layers. Firstly, then, it devalues the citizenship given by these countries. So, in order to achieve citizenship, you should be going through contribution. Look at every single other person in the world that isn't of African descent that has to apply to this country and contribute to this country for many, many years in order to actually achieve the citizenship and these benefits from the government. We think then when this is completely removed, it erodes the idea of the citizenship. Secondly, it creates a racist and xenophobic model in which people actually just have to be of a certain race to be able to enter this country and not through the merit of hard work. Why should we care this? Having a racist image and an unequitable image affects your international relationship. This looks like the Arabs not working. Thank you.
I now call second proposition speaker to continue the debate.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Salutations to Thousand Dutch. My name is Sanjay Mota, and I'm the second speaker of side proposition in today's debate. Expect two things from me in today's debate. I'll give you my rebuttal on what responses that we received from side opposition in today's debate, and then also get into two arguments on why is it that we propose this motion, and why is it that it's effective for our partner actors being the people who go to these African nations. Now let's get into my defensive rebuttals. So, my first speaker gave you a mechanism where the idea was to basically use a DNA profile, which is realistic because for individuals who go to African nations, so that they can basically use that as a way to actually test whether or not they deserve to be there or not, so that we can actually give them the incentive, so that they can be granted the right to be a citizen in that place. So now, what are the responses we receive from side opposition to today's debate? We get this idea that this is an illegitimate policy because it's going to degrade the economic and the political state of the country. Now, and then also in terms of what we also get from their side is the fact that they use the African citizens. And I have two responses for these responses. The first response is the fact that this is false, because when we look at our policy, it specifically states that we use individuals who are not in Africa and living abroad. However, they have the genetic root to actually be in Africa as a citizen, which is why we do so. But second of all, what they also say in response to our mechanism is the fact that this process requires months, because when people are supposed to be citizens, or they're supposed to actually get citizenship when they migrate to African nations, it is a process that requires months and months and months. This is true, and which is why is it that we propose to raise money, because we see the necessity in actually managing the mechanism where we grant citizens or not citizenships. Now, why do I say this, man? The reason why I say this is because the African citizens, I'll take them to a later stage. Why do I say this, man? because we see that these individuals, man, they already have the reasons as to why is it that they belong to that specific country. So therefore, man, we see it as a necessity that we don't give them, we actually give them the automatic citizenships, because the process requires months and months and months if we do it at large. And they have the special reason as to why is it that we do so. But more importantly, man, with the way that we actually use this mechanism, we are using DNA profiles just so that we can do this effectively. So what they see on why is it that our mechanism doesn't stand really does fall flat, because our mechanism is one that is based on the debate. Now let's get into the responses that they have given us on our point based on African culture. So panel, we give you this point on the fact that panel, by implementing this motion, panel, what then happens is the fact that we promote the culture and the roots of these African nations or of these individuals who belong to those African nations. But what is the response that we get from such position? Is the fact that the individuals and the people can actually use culture without citizenship. Now let's get into the responses of why is it that their argument doesn't stand, or their responses really doesn't maintain in this debate. Because firstly, we see that when we look at the citizenship and us giving them this, we're giving them the ability to express themselves through the cultural background, or through the roots of where they come from. So therefore, I take them at a later stage. So therefore, by actually continuously doing this, what therefore then happens is the fact that it gives you the benefit to associate yourself with the culture of the root space. So now, let's look at the comparative. They say that they can still get the culture without using censorship, without actually any analysis, but it's fine. Let's actually look at them at their best case. What they only get on the best case is only sensational culture, which is superficial, because at this point, at this stage, we don't find any sort of family or root. So therefore, on the impact and on the comparative, we both get culture, we both get cultural roots. However, we get it better because they experience the roots, they experience the sensation of being in that country. With that being said, I'd like to move on to my argument. Now, my first argument is based on the practicality of our mechanism and why is it that it's important for today's debate. What does this aim to achieve? It shows how it is far more effective to use our mechanism in the current status quo. We've spoken about the current status quo. How does it work? We see that, for example, in South Africa, it is not a guarantee that an individual is going to attain a citizenship. So therefore, it is far more imperative for us to give the individuals of the African descent, the automatic citizenship. Now let's actually understand and break down this point. Let's look at the analysis of this. When they come to South Africa, we see that when we implement this motion, they will no longer be treated as foreigners. My first speaker gave you a clarification as to why is it they won't be treated as foreigners. However, the efficiency of this, not taken. The efficiency of this is the fact that it becomes less administratively burdensome, because I've shown you that when individuals get to these countries, they no longer have to try to put it in their record that they're supposed to be like this, or put it in the record that they are actually willing to be in that country, And when they do this, there's a huge legitimacy point, and there's huge legitimacy impact that we get. What is this, So basically, this is the process where it requires documents, a lot of administrative belief, and we see that on the current status quo, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals who go on a day-to-day basis to these African nations, which then is burdensome in the current status quo due to the documents, the time, and the numbers of people constantly trying to be in these African nations. So therefore, on the impact, what does our mechanism do? It makes it far easier for African nations to manage the numbers of applicants who want to go to these nations on a day-to-day basis. But more importantly, it gives them the right it gives the right to the people who actually deserve the citizens. So therefore, it is far more practical, this mechanism, which then benefits our vulnerable actors. Now I'll move on to my second argument on how it leads to less stigma of our vulnerable actors, given the fact that they are the people who are with the African descendants living abroad. So now what does this argument really achieve? It basically achieves the eradication of the stigmatization, which is then far more better managed with this mechanism. Again, given the reason not taken, let's look at the status quo. We have yet so many foreigners who deal with instances where the African citizens are constantly portraying stigma from them. So basically that is to say that non-citizens of African nations are treated unfairly and unjust, and that is the truth, on how he or she deserves to be that country. For example, we see so many individuals where so many stigmas, so many opinions are portrayed to that person, and we see that as a result, they don't live the way they're supposed to live because of the stigma that exists. Which is then, on secondly, panel, in cases where the foreigners aim to go to this African nations panel, what really is sad about this is the fact that some of them they go for reasons such as work opportunities. However, due to the lack of citizenship that they have, the outcome here is the fact that they are unable to access some of the resources they require. They are unable to actually access the resources that they need so that they can do the work due to the fact that they are not the citizens of that country. Thirdly, I do want to say that we understand why is it that this is ongoing. However, we see it as unjust when an individual with African roots, African descendants, have to go through that process when they don't deserve this treatment. So on the impact, through this citizenship, we see the stigma of individuals that actually deserve to be there, and therefore the resources and the justified principles are portrayed for those who deserve it. With that, is that I think.
And I'll call second opposition speaker to continue opposition's case.
Good. Thanks, ready? Phone's ready? Ready? We're going 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe a fundamental analytical flaw of side opposition is the fact that they aren't able to engage with the case that we've given them, with the rebuttal that we've given them. I'm going to show you how this fundamentally takes down the case in my rebuttal, as well as in substantive matter that I will add towards this conversation. There's 2 chats that are happening within today's debate that is happening right now. The first chat is about the integrity of the policy, of their policy in terms of solving stigmatization, the issue that they've told us, but then secondly is the maintenance of cultural heritage that they've given on their side. Let's look at their policy first. They tell us 2 things about their policy and 2 things that I want to chat about. The first thing they tell us is that their policy avoids strenuous processes that would occur within the status quo, but then secondly they tell us that this policy doesn't only involve African descendants. It tells us that they tell us that it includes people who, yes, are African, but they need an actual incentive to stay within Africa. So if you're an African and you don't have an incentive to stay within Africa, then you don't get that African citizenship. 2 issues or 4 issues with this policy. Let's look at the first one, which they tell us that it avoids strenuous processes. 2 responses to this. Firstly, they tell us that they're going to be using DNA processing. By itself, using forensic evidence is already strenuous in of itself. Using scientific mechanisms like gathering data, processing that data, and analyzing that data is already strenuous in of itself. But furthermore, look at how strenuous it would be on African systems that are already overburdened. We already have Home Affairs systems that now have to adopt scientific mechanisms to adopt this. Something that Home Affairs doesn't even engage So we tell you that by adding this process, you are going to make this an overly strenuous process and overburdens the Home Affairs, the Home Affairs functions that we already have on their side. So they're only making this process more strenuous. Let's look at the second argument that it doesn't involve African descent. Notice two issues with this statement. Firstly, notice that it's uncharitable. They're literally squaring the motion as it clearly doesn't stipulate within the motion that it has to exclude certain African people. But okay, let me take them at the best case scenario. Notice that this is an inherent contradiction within their case. If I am an African descendant who lives in another country and I want to travel to Africa to learn about my culture, like what they talk about, but I want to go back to my home country afterwards, I'm going to be rejected because I don't want to live there for a while. So notice that they're infringing upon my cultural identity, wanting to explore my cultural roots and look at my identity. What is the impact of this? Twofold. First, you notice that their policy is unrealistic and they have a low chance of working because of the overburdening in some of what their policy wants, which means they're not going to solve that stigmatization that they talk about and what they say their policy is going to solve. But then secondly, notice that our policy actually works with the status quo and we get the same amount of cultural expression on our side. The next thing we're going to talk about is the whole chapter about cultural heritage. So they talk about identity and cultural expression and how they're going to get that from exploring cultural roots and allowing people to do that. Two responses to this. First, you notice that identity doesn't actually only include your ancestry. It also includes things like your empirical experience in an upbringing, being brought up in a nation and getting their culture brought onto you. Not just having your ancestry within it. By their metric, a descendant of a bad person, like someone like Stalin, is going to have their identity associated with Stalin just because that person is a descendant of Stalin. That's not how that works. That person can build their own different identity away from Stalin. But then notice then that secondly, even if we take them at their best case scenario, we still have a mechanism for people who do want to explore their cultural heritage. People who can't just apply for normal citizenship themselves or just visit the country. We still have a way for people to explore their identity and cultural roots. Cool. What we told you from the O1 is the illegitimate use of citizenship, and we told you about things like improper use of voting, the strain of poor economies, and unequitability. And what was the response we got from their side? Absolutely nothing. That means our impacts are threefold. Firstly, in terms of their side, they're going to have their international relations affected because no one wants to work with a country that's unequitable. Secondly, they're going to have an unhappy voter base. And thirdly, it's going to damage the quality of life for citizens who already have economic problems. The thing we get from the P2 actually is that if you have citizenship, you won't be treated as a foreigner. Notice the issue with this, and this links to my other point of rebuttal. Just because you have an ancestry doesn't mean you're an actual, you have the identity of that country, which I talked to you about, actually being upwards in that country. Descendants doesn't automatically link these two people, which means that that's not only going to solve stigmatization, because there can still be a tension because that person hasn't actually known. What is the impact of this? One, I've shown you that the policy doesn't work, which means they're not going to solve stigmatization, even if I took them at their base. But even if I look at their arguments, they still don't solve it, even if their policy works. Cool. With that in mind, I can move to my substantive matter of my assertion. My assertion for today's debate is that automatic citizenship degrades the economic and political integrity of the nations involved. This is built on a few premises. Firstly, notice that African bureaucratic and economic systems are already overburdened with sectoral issues within most of these nations. Look at things like SA or South Africa. We have home affairs issues that take so long with backlogs of citizens. Notice things like the DRC having issues with its own civil wars. Notice countries like Rwanda and Uganda who are already going through their own wars into themselves. What we can then see from that is that most African nations are going to be already backlogged and overburdened with their own issues. Notice secondly that living within broad areas accustoms that person within that culture and incentives of that country. I talked about this in my rebuttal. For example, if I live in France, it doesn't matter whether or not I have African descent, I will inherently be weighted towards the French culture and their incentives than African culture and African incentives because I grew up in France and I have a metaphysical attachment to France because I grew up there and it catered towards me. With that in mind, I'm going to talk about my two layers. The first layer is economical and bureaucratic burden. Because we know from my premises that most African nations already struggle with managing their own economic and bureaucratic issues, but then secondly, that giving African descendants automatic citizenship still requires putting in the work for accounting, not only with the DNA testing they're talking about, but the fact that Home Affairs workers have to now analyze documentation and those DNA things to approve of automatic citizenship, but then also have to account for the existence of these citizens living within their own country and out of the country. Therefore, what we see is that African nations who are already overburdened with these issues are are going to be exacerbated with more national issues, the issues that I listed before. What does this mean? Two things. Firstly is that degradation in managing these issues Management is going to suffer if more people are entering the country and if more processes are entering the systematic route. For example, the UK has already banned refugees from entering since the influx of people is becoming hard to manage. And if the UK is struggling with this, then you can imagine how the Africans are going to struggle with this. For example, you can already see this with South Africa and Home Affairs. I've already shown that before. The second thing I can talk about is foreign influence. Think back to what I said for my premises. Foreigners have a cultural integrity towards the country they are born in and the country they are grow up in. Not inherently African nations, even if they are descendants from an African nation. Notice then that citizenship allows people to have more control over national functions. Things like presidency, entering governmental bodies as a worker, and entering law bodies requires them to be a citizen of South Africa. For the fact that you can't have, because of the fact that they don't want foreign influence influencing governmental and lawful decisions. This then means that foreign companies now have a mechanism of entering African countries and influencing those bodies for their own preferences. Sure, this may be a fair case, but the mere fact that it can now happen is an issue. In the status quo, we protect against this already within our constitution, but if we take that away, then we risk that national integrity. For impacting is twofold. Firstly, national integrity is protected. Management on their side is going to function slower and at a lower quality, and tensions between culture are going to increase. This doesn't happen on our side because we are actually opposing the motion of lower. Thank you.
I thank that speaker and call the proposition speaker to finish proposition space.
Yes.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. One thing I'd like to start with is the contention between the parties on whether this policy is actually effective or not. And to do this, I'd like to really contextualize this debate. First, how does a citizenship actually look like, and what is the purpose of citizenship? Right? The citizenship tells you or grants you the ability to say that you are indigenous to that specific area. Therefore, you get a sense of belonging to a specific area. Notice, panel, what the opposing side are constantly perpetuating is a permanent residency. They give us this whole narrative that it is not going to work because you need to contribute to the economy for you to be able to gain a citizenship. But I'll be going through this further on in my case, right? So salutations to the House of Lords. I'm today's first speaker, and I'll be doing two main stuff. My strategic flaws, as one of the clashes I've identified within today's debate, right? Firstly, let me go to my strategic flaws, right? They concede to the fact that the citizenship process is actually inherently flawed in itself. And we acknowledge that, because when you look at the citizenship process on itself, we know that number one, it is one which is long, it's people have to wait. And then number two, the citizenship is not a guarantee even if they apply for it. So now when you look at our mechanism, we tell you that at the point at which they have descendants from within the family lineage who is indigenous to that specific African state, therefore you should grant them this automatic citizenship. But notice, what is important to note, how automatic citizenship actually looks like. It looks like you skipping the process of actually applying for citizenship, and at the point at which they find that you have got African lineage in your blood, you are able to attain that citizenship without going through the process that everyone has to go through. Because you need to notice that everyone in this country can apply for citizenship, whether they're indigenous to South Africa or not. But at the point at which someone who is indigenous needs to go to the same through the same process, that is far more harmful within today's debate. But then number two, right? What we totally get from this side is that stigma. Yes.
The people you're speaking about are descendants. They aren't indigenous who lived in the land and had personal connection. So why is it then that they should have a separate process purely for themselves?
You need to understand that when we talk about descendants, it could be people who are dead, who are indigenous to that specific country, right? And these people now who are applying for the citizenship are people who are already living and who are related to these descendants. Now, moving on, we need to notice that stigmatization is going to exist at the point at which you don't grant them this thing, and this is something they concede to, right? The reason why it is going to exist is because if you're in that country, if you do not have any citizenship, you are going to be treated like a foreigner. If we look at South Africa's status quo, if you're a foreigner, you will have stigmatization associated with you, and to a certain extent, there is going to be xenophobia which steps towards you. Now, as I've done with my strategic flows, I'll be going on to the clash that I've identified within today's debate. Right? On my first clash is on the clash of identity. So now, what do you get from outside of the house? We tell you, we give you three main layers. We tell you that it's by giving these people automatic citizenship, it is going to lead to government arguments accumulating. I'll be taking pictures at the stage. It leads to the deterrence of stigma. Then number two, we say that it's going to give you people the liberty to explore their roots. And then our third layer is that it's going to give them a better understanding of their background and where they come from, and they're going to get a sense of belonging. You need to know that the last point was something which was not touched from their side of the house. But then what do we actually get in terms of response? Right? They tell you that a document won't mean that people will accept it. We need to understand this is logically flawed from the get-go, right? Because when you look at status quo, for example, South Africa, if you cannot prove that you are citizenship by an indigenous people, then they will consider you a foreigner, right? And at the point at which they consider you a foreigner, they're going to treat you like they're going to believe that you do not have, you are not entitled to the benefits which citizens have in that particular country, right? And at the point at which these benefits are mutually exclusive to people, to these people, and you cannot give an indigenous person a citizenship, we believe that is going to be harmful to these people, right? However, let's see what we get from the side of the debate under this clash. We get a couple of layers, and I'll be going through them, right? Before I do so, PR, yes.
Speaker, do you think African people are dumb enough not to recognize the fact that these people weren't born in the country and lived in another country for the whole life?
Even if they do so, if you look at, for example, the situation in KZN, if you cannot efficiently prove that you're a citizen to South Africa, there is going to be resistance and there's going to be xenophobia perpetuated towards you. Now, moving on, right? What we get from this side of the house is that it's going to lead to people getting illegitimate citizenship, right? And we get the fact that the government or people are going to manipulate these specific people. And the third thing is that we're going to get people who are exploited, because the African nations are going to be exploited because these people aren't contributing to society as a whole. Firstly, on the point of illegitimate citizenship, you need to notice, panel, that this is something which is logically flawed again, because these people are actually applying for this. And at the point at which you say it's illegitimate, you say that illegal, which is something which cannot be credited. And we are telling you that for you to be a citizen, you need to have people, or you need to be indigenous to a specific land. But then moving on, panel, on the thing to exploiting on manipulation. Manipulation is inherently going to exist through the form of propaganda, and the government or people within the specific countries will try to perpetuate propaganda in order for them to gain a mass audience. And either way, you don't need a citizenship for you to go and vote. What you actually need is an ID, which is called an identification document. Therefore, that point and the clash doesn't stay, right? However, moving on to my way matrix on why we win this debate, why we win this clash, even if we take them at their best in our words. At our worst, when we use the way matrix of utilitarianism, right, we find that we benefit the largest stakeholder of people compared to them. The reason why I say so is that there is an eradication of the loss of identity within these same people who are actually affected in today's debate. And we find that on our side of the house, we cater for the vulnerable actors, right? However, now moving on to my second chapter of identified within today's debate, and that is on the burden which exists on either side. Now, What we get from this side of the house, right, is that it is going to overburden certain people or certain stakeholders which are involved, such as the Home Office, right? And then they say this is something, because this is problematic because they have to analyze documents, right? They consider our case because we tell you that when we look at our role or when you look at our model, this is something which doesn't exist. So at that point, that process is mutually exclusive on this side of the house, and they do not cater for it or do not deal with it at that point in the debate. Therefore, that is not something that they can conceptualize or win over that, right? However, let's look on the fact that they say that they say that everyone, it won't be efficient due to the overload. Right? When you look at our side of the debate and when you look at the characterization of how automatic citizenship looks like, we find that this is not going to exist. Now, if I use way matrix, right, and then through efficiency, we basically get this. Yes,
does DNA processing not require extensive searching and documentation and extensive amounts of financial resources?
You need to notice that there are less stakeholders involved as far as the process is, because at the point at which you are applying for citizenship, you need to go to the VFS, you need to go to the consulate. At the point at which you need a DNA profile, you just need to go to one specific laboratory or even to the hospital and you can get your DNA extracted. So at the point at which you exacerbate the externalities of actually applying a DNA thingy, it shows how your lack of understanding of our model, therefore you constantly perpetuating how our model doesn't look like. However, now moving on to the efficiency of this, on efficiency, we are best efficient with today's debate. The reason why I say so is for two main reasons. At the point at which you just need a DNA profiling to state whether, to determine whether you are citizenship or not, or if you have African descent or not, we find that that is far more efficient than having to go through the process of actually applying for citizenship. As we find that at the point at which you need to apply for citizenship, there are far more too many logistics which are involved, and also we need to acknowledge the fact that citizenship, at the point at which you need to apply for it, and it is not automatically granted, is not something which is going to be given. So now when we look at both worlds at large, like, what do both worlds look like? Number one, on this side of the house, it looks like a world whereby even if I have got African descent, or to use a prime example, if Doja Cat, for example, has African descent, she cannot get a citizenship just because she's an African. Right? On our side of the house, we say yes, because she has African descent within the lineage, therefore she's entitled to.
There's an advert for Holiday Inn on that table. The bottles. We get the complimentary in the rooms.
I now call the opposition speaker to conclude the debate. Okay, I'd like to count myself in 3, 2, 1. Two very important questions you need to ask yourself. The first is that who's more legitimate for citizenship, and the second is that which side has better economic and political degradation. But before that, there's two important contextual issues we need to answer. The first is the fatal misunderstanding of how this policy is going to work. Proposition outlines that current citizenship mechanisms take an extremely long period of time because of all the documentation that's involved. And the solution then is let's put DNA testing, and we're going to open up clinics in every single country, we're going to have the money to fund it, and we're going to track every single person of every single African descent, and we're going to be able to track them down perfectly and give them citizenship. understand you literally end up with the same problem. You're going to go through a lot more documentation to check every single person. You're going to spend a lot more money opening up clinics for DNA testing. If they say that there's a problem, the solution doesn't fix it. The second thing in terms of context then is what they tell you in terms of these applicants. There's two things here. The first is that they say that no, these people feel like outsiders because they lack African citizenship and there's social stigmas that exist. The response is to say that citizenship isn't going to fix stigmatization. In South Africa, for example, there are literal people from other African countries who have citizenship here, yet are still seen as foreigners, and there's still xenophobic protests that go on. Why? Because they weren't born here. So having a mere document that says that no, you have the right to be here, doesn't then mean people are going to suddenly accept you and fix a social environment. But the second thing they tell you is that no, all people who get the citizenship are going to have an incentive to come here. Two responses. One, this is motions following. You can't choose which people you're going to accept to come here. There are going to be people who don't have an incentive to find out about their heritage and just get the citizenship regardless. So you can't only engage with a certain percentage of applicants. But secondly, even if it's not motion squirreling, there's no way to properly establish an incentive for a person coming here unless you're going to go through the same long process that currently exists with citizenship documents, so they end up with the same problem that they keep telling you they fix. Why the Women context is twofold. One, we're more realistic as to what citizenship actually looks like, but then secondly, we're better understanding of how their model works, and we engage with a broader spectrum of applicants. Before the first issue, any POIs? Cool. The first issue then on illegitimate citizenship. Under this, the proposition gives you two things. The first thing they tell you is that no, people need the citizenship in order to get a core understanding of where they come from, their background, and their identity. There's two responses here. The first is to say that this is not mutually exclusive, it can be done in our world. There's visa applications, there's tourist applications, there's current citizenship applications. This also allows you to come to the country which your ancestors were from and find out about your heritage. But then the second response is to say that the claim in of itself is misleading. It creates the impression that those who are descendants of Africans should only be seen as Africans. You harm the identity of people who come from other continents and still belong to that identity. Think of people like African Americans who are perfectly fine with their identity. You say no, your identity is only being African, and you should come here to find out about your roots. Your roots have nothing to do with your ancestors who may have in a separate geographic area. The second thing they tell you is that no, if you can't get citizenship, then you're going to be treated as a foreigner. There's two responses here. The first is to say that this already dealt this under context in terms of stigmatization. But the second is we don't think it's as big as an issue as proposition seems to make it out to be. We think that literally there isn't that many African people from the African continent who go on social media and bully those who are the citizens of Africans who live in other continents and say that no, you don't know your identity, you are a problem, we don't accept you. We think that there's actual bigger issues that African citizens pay attention to. But furthermore, if that is the case, then you truly feel like a foreigner, you can apply for citizenship and come and live here, and over time you can be accepted. Cool. What we then tell you on this issue that goes unresponded to is Siobhan's entire O1 argument. He gives you three important halves. The first thing he spoke to you about is the inaccurate voting. He spoke to you about how these are people who are from separate continents and they are not going to be as informed to have the voting rights of native African citizens or people who live within the country. We told you then how they lead to inaccurate representation and that leads to societal harms such as inaccurate solving of societal issues. The second thing we spoke to you about is the abuse of resources, the wastage of resources. If you're going to be funding DNA clinics in every single country and tracking down every single descendant, that comes with taxpayer money. But not every single person is going to contribute back to the African country. So there's no reciprocalism in terms of how that money is going to be generated and how it's going to be used. But the third thing he speaks to you about is the inequality of it, where you create two tiers of citizenship. This has already been done in other countries such as India, which has the Citizenship Amendment Act. This was created in order to provide some sort of refugee status or citizenship status for those on the Indian subcontinent who were perceived to be refugees or minorities. However, what ended up happening is that there's a lot of Muslims in the Indian subcontinent that were being persecuted, but because they weren't classified as a majority who had roots within India, they weren't given citizenship. This then fueled xenophobia and racism between Hindus and Muslims within India and led to an impact on geopolitical relationships. Where India now had harming geopolitical relationships with a lot of Arab Muslim majority states. Why then we win this issue is twofold. Firstly, in terms of our burdens, we proved to you how granting automatic citizenship is illegitimate. But secondly, in terms of their burdens, they don't prove to you any exclusive cultural benefit that comes with automatic citizenship that we can't get on our side of the house. Before my second issue, any POIs? Cool. Second issue then, being an economic and political degradation. There's two things they speak to you about here. The first is the degradation of personal relationships of indigenous people. There's two responses here. One, we simply don't think that that's true. We think that the people we are talking about are contributing to an entirely separate geographic area. We don't think that they're indigenous to these areas. Sure, they may have roots, but we think they're actually indigenous to other foreign countries. We think that they have far more personal connections to the people there, with the environment there, with the institutions there. But the second response is say that there isn't actually any delegation. If you want to come and find out about your roots, about your ancestors, nobody's stopping you. You can apply for visas, you can apply for citizenships. Again, we don't get the harms that they're trying to speak to you about. The second thing they tell you on this issue is something about propaganda, where the third speaker brings up the no, government's going to manipulate people. To this point in my speech, I have no idea what manipulation is going on, because I don't know what the government is doing. They don't explain to us how the government is manipulating people, or how automatic citizenship is going to prevent this manipulation. They just assert it, so we need the analysis of whatever that point to be credited to them. But in terms of what we tell you on this issue, is two things. Firstly, we spoke to you about the strain on the economies of African countries. Both sides agree that they're already poor in terms of economics and infrastructure. Both sides already agree that there's a lack of taxpayer money. So if we're going to waste it on extensive processes and we're going to open ourselves up to more immigration, it's likely going to result not only in the further degradation economically, but again through further tensions with current citizens. The second thing we spoke to you about then is the improper representation because of excessive immigration. My O2 gave you the example of Britain and what happened there and how people with tensions were fueled and people began to hate immigrants. We then told you that no, we need a proper system, not two-tiered immigration. Why did we win this issue is threefold. Firstly, in terms of their burdens, they failed to prove to you how automatic citizenship doesn't result in economic and political degradation. Secondly, in terms of our burdens, we proved to you how it actually undermines economies and the political state of countries. But then thirdly, let's use their own weighing metric against it. They tell us that the weighing metric of this debate should be utilitarianism. The only benefit that they prove is to those who are descendants of African countries. They don't prove to you how automatic citizenship is going to benefit citizens already within these countries, nor the governments in of themselves. Because we're able to prove to you how we cater for three sets of actors and they only cater for one, we think then that they are losing on their own weighing metric. It's for those reasons then that a world in which we have automatic citizenship will forever be a past I regret, a future I post, and a present I will not stand for. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our teams a massive round of applause.